Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this week's edition of our morning briefing series. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Karl Kaiser Forum here at DGAP. Today, we want to discuss the new US national security strategy that was published last week, and that has been subject of debate since. The document reiterates and enshrines in writing the rhetoric used by Vice President JD Vance at the 2025 Munich Security Conference. It blames Europe for insufficient military spending and criticizes unrealistic expectations among European leaders for Russia's war on Ukraine. It claims that the majority of Europeans want a different Ukraine policy and that European governments are suppressing opposition views, which is not true. According to the latest polls, we know that more than 2/3 of the population actually believe that Ukraine's defense is important to their own countries. And that's true across Britain, France, Poland, and Germany. And by the way, also in the US. In any case, to prevent what the document describes as civilizational erasure, Washington seeks to, quote, cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. In other words, interfere in the domestic affairs of America's allies. The national security strategy is astonishingly blunt and has been criticized as unacceptable in parts by Chancellor Merz and also European Council President Costa and others. On the other hand, perhaps there are some less outlandish points that might garner approval on both sides of the Atlantic, such as slowing NATO expansion, for example. And to be fair, the document does confirm that Europe remains a strategically and culturally vital ally to the United States. Trump wants to promote European greatness, in his own words, as the chapter title says. So what are we to make of this document? Is this the end of the transatlantic friendship as we know it? Are there any silver linings, perhaps? And what are the next steps for Europeans to act? To discuss these and other questions, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. First up will be Dr. Amanda Sloat, who's Professor of Practice at IE University in Spain currently, and was formerly a Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council in the United States. She previously served in senior positions at the State Department in the Obama administration and in between government positions held fellowships at Brookings and Harvard. She holds a PhD in politics from the University of Edinburgh. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. I have to say, you have given me the unenviable task of trying to explain how this document was drafted, and I can shed some light on how it was drafted when I was in government, but cannot claim to have any particular insight into the current process.
Thanks, Amanda. I'll get you started in a second. Let me just introduce the other speakers,
sorry.
and I'll get back to you in a second. After you, we'll hear from Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, who's the Otto Wolff Director of DGAP. Thomas spent many years in the US as a journalist and a think tanker, and is a keen observer of all things transatlantic. Last but not least, we'll hear from our senior research fellow, Rachel Tausenfreund, who's covering the United States and transatlantic relations here at DGAP. She was previously a fellow and editorial director at GMF, and she just came back from a trip to the US, so we'll look forward to some insights from you as well. Before we begin, let me just remind everyone that we're on the record and that this will be uploaded subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here as per usual with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then open up for Q&A after about 25 or 30 minutes or so. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and keep your question relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all my colleagues making this series possible. And now, without further ado, over to you, Amanda, if you can help us make sense of where this NSS comes from, what the background is, some influences, some key messages, anything to help us make sense of it.
Sorry, I was excited and raring to go this morning, so jumped in a bit early. But thanks to you and DGAP for the invitation and everybody for tuning in. So just a couple of broad framing comments. The first thing to remember is that the National Security Strategy is a formal document that's required as a result of congressional legislation that was passed in 1986. So the aim is to communicate the executive branch's national security vision to the legislative body to discuss the proposed uses of all facets of US power needed to achieve the nation's security goals. Now, in practice, and this is true across administrations, there's not an exact correlation between what's written and what happens. National security strategies tend to give little operational guidance to practitioners, and it's usually disconnected from budgetary realities and priorities. So I think it's important to read this as, in some ways, a codification of how the administration views the world, but it's not necessarily a defining document or a blueprint for everything that they plan to do subsequently. I think it was also quite striking with this document that it was not rolled out with any particular fanfare. It was released essentially in the middle of the night. There was not an accompanying speech by the president or by the national security advisor. So one interpretation of this is that it was a box checking exercise by the administration, given the congressional requirement, and really can just be seen as a broad set of their perspectives. Now, as you said, in many ways, this codifies what we have seen from the administration in the past, particularly on the Europe section. It reflects what the vice president said already in February in his Munich speech. We have seen the administration spending a significant amount of time and energy focused on Latin America, while deprioritizing time in the Middle East and in Africa, certainly. Now, one thing you can definitely say about this document is that it seems to provide an honest reflection of the Trump administration's views. And so it's actually quite helpful and clarifying from that perspective. If you remember back to the first Trump administration, the national security strategy read like a fairly mainstream Republican foreign policy document, although you had a cover letter written by the president that much more reflected his views. And so this actually is a very honest, I think, interpretation of how the administration sees the world. And so I think it's a useful and clarifying document from that perspective. In terms of process, normally what happens is that you have a series of interagency meetings over a period of months where different government departments get to weigh in on their priorities. There then is a revision of numerous drafts. It's usually written and directed by the Office of Strategic Planning and the National Security Council. And like many documents in the government, it can be quite a bureaucratic exercise where people are arguing over particular word phrases and want to have some of their priorities highlighted. As I said, I think this does reflect the president's views. I am sure it reflects the views of Marco Rubio, who's really been spearheading a lot of the efforts on Latin America. Interestingly, there had been an expectation, I think, that some of Bridge Colby, who's the Undersecretary for Defense in the Pentagon and a very known China hawk, that Asia and some efforts to restrain China would be much more central than they are. And of course, you have had Stephen Miller and others in the White House that have been very active on the immigration file. Now, just a couple of quick comments on the overall approach. I think it's fairly clear that there is a focus here on profits and economic benefit for the United States. That is a key theme that runs through a lot of the document. Certainly, it ends what had been a focus of the United States in the past on democracy and speaking up for human rights. Certainly, the administration is not going to be critiquing authoritarians, not hectoring Middle East monarchies. Interestingly, there's also a very limited view of global competition, which was a theme that we had through a number of national security strategies, including President Trump's first term. Russia is not described as an adversary, and China is viewed as a competitor, mainly in an economic sense. There's also a focus on constraint, although that is somewhat divergent from what we have seen in practice with the very surgical strike on Iran, and then the significant military buildup that we're seeing now around Venezuela. Most striking, as I said, is the elevated focus on Latin America, including reference to the Monroe Doctrine with the Trump corollary. And the deprioritization in a way of China is quite striking because that is something where there had been a bipartisan consensus in Washington, with China described as the pacing threat. So there's a lot of focus on China from an economic competition sense, although there is a nod, of course, to not wanting to have a military conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. And as you set out in your opening comments, and I will let other speakers comment on, the Europe section, particularly for those of you living here in Europe, has been the most striking. So let me leave it there.
Thanks so much, Amanda. If you allow, I want to ask a brief follow-up question on Europe before we hand over to Thomas, who will look at the Europe section from Europe's point of view. But perhaps you could say a few words from Washington's point of view, in terms of the influences that may have gone into the section, and the view from Washington across the Atlantic. Is there anything striking that you see in the section that you hadn't anticipated, or anything that you would comment from a US perspective before we turn to Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's most striking is the sense that they have actually codified a lot of this. In a way, there's not a lot that's surprising because it's been consistent with what JD Vance has said and what the administration has been doing all along. I mean, JD Vance set much of this out already in February in his Munich speech. If you look at the human rights report produced by the State Department, dictator-run El Salvador gets a higher freedom score than Germany does in terms of its assessment on the free press. Deputy Secretary of State Landau was in Europe last week doing meetings at NATO, the EU, the OSCE. Many of the comments that he put out on social media are reflected here. I think it is quite striking to have an official American document making such a strong set of statements on Europe in terms of the cultural issues. Now, in terms of influence, cultural issues is also something that obviously has become a hallmark of this administration at home. The State Department even this week changed the font that diplomats are using, calling the Biden administration's change from Times New Roman to Calibri unnecessary wokeness. Which had been implemented from some disability guidance because it was easier to read, and so it's not a surprise that given the focus that it has there at home, it's also something that it's targeting Europe for. I think it is quite striking to see the references to NATO, including, as you said, the non-expansion of that. Again, the focus on defense spending, and then some of the other critiques that it makes of Europe are ones that it has made before, in terms of the excessive regulation and some of the slower decision making. So to me, the most shocking part was seeing it all written down, the very strong attacks on the civilization piece. But in a way, like I said, I think it's a quite honest assessment of how they see Europe and is consistent, frankly, with a lot of the messages they've been giving all year.
An honest assessment. Thanks, Amanda. Thomas, how to read this document from a European point of view, from a German point of view? Over to you.
Good morning and thank you. I want to make 3 points. This, I would say, is not just a national security document, but it's a document of culture war and a pamphlet of the Anti-Enlightenment. In that sense, Amanda, it is honest. It's also a divorce letter from liberal Europe, and it's my third point. It's entirely unclear what it means and what importance it will carry. To my first point, I remember meeting Donald Trump's first, or the State Department under Donald Trump's first policy planning chief, Chiron Skinner, a short-lived tenure at the State Department, who wanted to pull together Donald Trump's tweets and turn it into a Trump doctrine. At that point, one would have said, good luck. But I think in a way, this has come true now. We're seeing a document that synthesizes and formalizes Trump's instincts, his long-held views and convictions, and there's especially 4 not statements but utterances of different quality that play a part here, and Amanda has mentioned a number of them. First of all, there's the second inaugural that is relevant to this document because it was the first time the hemispheric imperialism of this administration was stated. Second, JD Vance's speech in Munich because of its culture war tone. Third, the takedown of Zelensky in the Oval Office because of the tone of contempt that especially in the Europe section goes through this document. And fourthly, the 28-point plan, which, as we can see in this document, has more American ingredients than one would have thought when looking at the Ukraine-Russia negotiations from at the time a few weeks ago. It is very striking in its presentism. There is no history in it. This is a present tense document for a present tense time in a social media world. It doesn't talk about it, doesn't take a reference to it. It also collides with international reality in that it focuses U.S. foreign policy onto the Western Hemisphere, even though the Indo-Pacific has become the world's economic center, and the most relevant war of this time and age is not happening in the Western Hemisphere, it's happening in Europe. So one wonders where this comes from, and of course that is a reference to the Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine. And let's remember, the Monroe Doctrine at the time was a defensive argument. It threatened European colonialists not to meddle in South and Middle America. Here, there is no such thing. It's more of an aggressive, offensive version of a Monroe Doctrine. And as Amanda said, it uses the term strategic stability for a number of purposes, and I'll get back to that. Most importantly, it legitimizes, without mentioning it, the zones of influence and the idea of great powers carving up the world, and that defines the relations, especially to Russia and China. Second point, a divorce letter from liberal Europe. I'd say Europe, but liberal Europe. A document written in contempt, done denunciation of liberal Europe, especially the European Union, of liberalism per se. And it's a document, from my perspective, designed to humiliate Europe. Europe is doomed, facing, as you mentioned, Jan, civilizational erasure, to which cultural resistance must be garnered by the United States. In other words, America wants to meddle in European affairs, and it will press for what one could call regime change. There's supposed to be a longer version of this document in which the tools to do that are mentioned. So this is not a departure from the Transatlantic Alliance, but a redefinition of it as a right-wing alliance. And that's the term that I think you mentioned, Amanda, the cultural and strategic ally. Well, it's the ally that the United States wants to build, and therefore, in my interpretation, Europe is not an ally but an object of this thinking. NATO appears as a structure that needs to be managed, restrained, disciplined. There's no clear commitment, but there's also no clear departure. There's no critique of Russia. European elites are blamed for standing in the way of peace. What I found striking here, that America seeks strategic stability with Europe just as it seeks strategic stability with Russia in these terms. So there is an equidistance in this document between the two. This administration thinks it will have to mediate frictions between Europe and Russia. A lot of diplomatic energy, I think the term was, will be needed to do that. And that reminds me of point 4 in the 28-point plan that was presented for a ceasefire in Ukraine. And that point was that strategic frictions between NATO and Russia should be mediated by the United States. We can clearly see that that was no typo, that the United States no longer sees itself as a part of NATO, but as a mediator. This document is a little contradictory in it, but it has this side of it as well. To sum this one up, Norbert Röttgen has called this a second Zeitenwende. The first one was the attack, the full-scale attack of Russia on the Ukraine, to which Germany reacted with its 100 billion package. And the second one is this administration. Röttgen takes this document. I would rather take the succession of utterances, starting with the second inaugural, which are the second Zeitenwende, and the second one, that the United States is, from a German standpoint, no longer a reliable ally, is probably the more important. If the West was okay, it would be easier to deal with the first part of Zeitenwende, which is Russia. Since it isn't, that has become much harder.
Thomas, now, I have to cut you off in a second. Can you finish real quick, please?
Yes, I will make the third point in it. I have no clue what this document will mean to history, whether it will go away quickly. It is certainly, as Amanda put it, an honest document of what they think, but the U.S. Congress, the House just passed a bill wanting to make sure that no troop reductions in Europe take place below 70,000 personnel. So it is a document also in a domestic struggle, of the outcome of which is very unclear. And our response to such a drastic document should keep that in mind.
Thanks, Thomas. Let's see if we can identify some silver linings. There needs to be some way forward, Rachel. Can you help us to introduce a bit of optimism in all of this doom and gloom?
I mean, I'm not sure it'll be optimism, but I want to sort of lower some of the temperatures, or maybe it's a kind of reassurance in a way. Look, this national security strategy, the biggest problem with this national security strategy is not the ethno-nationalist, really extreme and honest ethno-nationalist tone of it. It's that there is no strategic vision. I think that's the bigger problem for Europe. If the United States is your primary partner, then this document indicates that this administration doesn't know where it's going strategically. What does it think of China? We don't know, because I guess they don't know. And that, I think, is the bigger problem. Russia, as Thomas mentioned as well. And in a way, that's kind of the silver lining. So we know that there's this Christian ethno-nationalist tenor in this administration. JD Vance told it. We know that there's a strong European transatlantic alliance. But if we put that aside in the sort of insult to liberal Europe, which is problematic, it's also problematic when it comes from European far-right parties or the right wing of center-right parties. And I think we should definitely be worried about that. But in terms of what would have been very worrying is if they had been more specific about an actual vision of leaving Europe alone. And they actually aren't in this document. I mean, you cited some of the quotes, Jan, in the beginning. Europe remains strategically and culturally vital. I mean, the cultural note there is, of course, in exchange for values, probably, which would have been previously in the national security strategy. So Europe is vital. There's the line, we count on creative, capable, confident, democratic allies. There is a clear wish to not have NATO expand, but there isn't anything about withdrawing from NATO, weakening NATO. Actually, the Indo-Pacific chapter is, more reasonable in many ways. Problematic only in that what's written in the strategy document doesn't seem to be reflected in policy. There's a mention of continuing to improve ties with India in order to strengthen the Quad. I don't see that reflected in current policy, but at least it's good that that's what they think the strategy should be. And so the silver lining, I think, is first of all the things that are there. When they talk about actual security topics, which is few and far between in the Europe chapter, then all of that is no news, right? There isn't anything about force reduction, changing the posture, all of this stuff. They do restate very important elements like a commitment to nuclear deterrence for allies. That's explicitly stated. And so I feel like, first of all, yes, the ethno-nationalism is honest, but maybe it's also a bit of a distraction, right? It achieved also what it wanted to. All of Europe reacted to the ethno-nationalist stuff. It didn't comment on the fact that there's not really much of a strategy there. And so that's both a silver lining and a very big problem, in that you have an administration on which Europe very much relies that doesn't seem to know exactly what its strategy is yet vis-a-vis Russia, China. We're still waiting on the force posture review. That might be reassuring, or it might be very worrying, and then we'll know more. But what I see in this document is a lot of bluster, a lot of posturing, a lot of sort of checking the boxes of your friends and allies, the friends and allies of the ethno-nationalists in the Trump administration here and in Europe. But I don't see anything that indicates something concrete that Europe should be worried about. If I think back to, for example, the George W. Bush national security strategy, it really laid out this preemptive strike element as a strategic vision. And that was then followed by the invasion of Iraq, right? And I don't necessarily see that here. Even the Western Hemisphere bit, how exactly they're going to interpret the Monroe Doctrine isn't clear. If they mean it in the sort of original sense of the Monroe Doctrine to prevent China from establishing a greater presence in Latin America, right? The sort of modern corollary to the European powers of the 19th century, or how exactly they mean it, because they're not clear on what the view of China is. So I'm not saying anything about the strategy is actually good. I'm just saying that there are other things to be worried about, I think much bigger things to be worried about in the strategy than the obviously and unsurprisingly consistent ethno-nationalism.
Right. Thanks, Rachel. And don't worry, you're not on the record saying that it's actually good, but you certainly pointed out some interesting aspects. And saying that there's not actually a lot of strategy, I mean, you could argue on the other hand that there are priorities being set, and that's something that the German national security strategy published in 2023 has been criticized for not doing. So in this document here, the US one, we see clearly emphasized borders, infrastructure, military, nuclear deterrence. There's a striking sentence in the beginning that says, not every country, region, issue, or cause, however worthy, can be the focus of American strategy. So I wonder, just playing devil's advocate here, is there something in this strategy and the way that American national strategies, security strategies are being made that Germans might actually learn from, or that Germans could pick up in answering this strategy? And I wonder what both you, Amanda, and Thomas and Rachel have to say about that. I also want to open this up for questions and answers in the audience, and I see that people are already posting some questions in the chat. So if I could add one or two of those to my own follow-up question. There's one by Johannes Regenbrecht, who's asking about the systematics and the structure of the paper. So where is Europe placed in the document, and how does that relate to past versions of this paper? And there's a question by Robert Harrison about defense procurement and the extent to which Europeans should be worried about defense equipment contracts and long-term maintenance contracts. Should we be worried about Americans no longer honoring these in the future and a possible using a kill switch? So Amanda, can I turn it back to you first, and please also feel free to react to your colleagues. Over to you, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I agree with Rachel's cautionary notes here and would underscore what I had said at the beginning. I mean, this is a congressionally mandated report that generally involves a lot of bureaucratic infighting, a lot of haggling over priorities, and it was released without any particular fanfare. And I completely understand and sympathize with the very upset European reaction to what was included in the document. But based on my own experience with this, it is not necessarily a blueprint for what's going to happen. As Rachel said, we're still waiting for the force posture review to come out. There's obviously some differing views in Congress still on this. And in many ways, it codifies what the administration has been saying and doing all along. In terms of the structure of the document, they tend to follow similar structures, where the first part of the document sets out a broader conceptual approach, and then there is a section on the regions. And the order in which the regions are listed tends to prioritize the importance that the administration puts on the successive listings of regions. And so with this one, Latin America is listed first, which signifies to me that that is the region that the administration is prioritizing. And certainly everything we have seen with the immigration fight domestically in the US, this focus on drugs, the military buildup we're seeing around Venezuela, that is consistent with what is happening. You then have Asia second, Europe third, and this administration very clearly has been seeking to deprioritize the Middle East, and then Africa gets about half a page at the very end. In the Biden administration, Asia was presented first, given the sense of China as the pacing threat. As the Europe senior director, I had advocated to have Europe listed first because I believe strongly in the importance of the transatlantic partnership. But Asia, as consistent with what the first Trump administration had and the Obama administration had, was seen as the top priority, mainly because of the threats that subsequent bipartisan administrations were placing on what we were seeing with China. One of the questions that I saw in the chat asked, I mean, what this should mean for Europeans and what Europe should do. To me, I would follow on with Thomas's quoting of Röntgen of this as a second Zeitenwende. The administration has been extremely clear all year about how it sees Europe and how it wants to approach Europe. And so if it was not already clear before, I hope that writing it down in black and white has now made it very, very clear for Europe. And I think Europe really needs to act. There's been a significant amount of time and effort over the last year and beyond to identify areas in which Europe needs to strengthen its own capabilities and, frankly, reduce the dependencies that it has on the US. NATO military planners, as part of the process leading up to the Hague summit, has given every country a set of very specific military requirements that they need, including the creation of critical enablers on which Europe is still dependent on the US. That has to happen. Second, you've had reports from Draghi, from Letta, talking about things that Europe needs to do to strengthen its own single market. That needs to happen. Europe is also very dependent on the United States in terms of technology, cloud computing, and other services. There's been some work on digital sovereignty. That needs to be expedited. And finally, Europe needs to take steps to shore up its own democracy. Yes, the new democracy shield is a good start. A lot of those measures are voluntary. They also tend to focus on threats coming from outside. But there's also a lot of challenges that Europe is facing internally from the rise of these far-right parties that Europe needs to address and shore up as well. So to the question on what Europe needs to do, I would argue take this as your final wake-up call. Be very serious about the reforms that are needed in Europe and build on a lot of the very good work that has already been done. I think Europe knows what it needs to do. Now it just needs to move forward and implement those reforms.
There have been a lot of wake-up calls. In fact, I think the word wake-up call became something of a joke following this past Munich Security Conference. You might have well turned it into a drinking game because there have been so many wake-up calls, and the pressure has steadily increased on European governments to finally respond to those calls. But now we have it again in writing. And so I guess I'm asking, what makes us optimistic that this final wake-up call will make a difference? And how do you comment on the question by Marcel Beutel as well in the chat, who's asking specifically about Chancellor Merz's reaction to the NSS?
Amanda laid out the agenda, I think, very clearly. I'll underscore the thing of, the capability targets are very clear. It's sort of a brilliant innovation, if you want to think of it that way. And Europeans have no excuse for not meeting those or heading briskly toward those targets as soon as possible. And that's number one. Secondly, I want to also underscore the domestic aspect of this, right? What I personally, as someone who also lives in Germany, hope is that the language of this document is also a bit of a mirror to not only to sort of the democratic parties in Europe about where certain kinds of rhetoric about immigration, civilizational decline, anti-regulation, what it looks like in the form that they don't want, because there are some real democratic challenges in Europe, and that needs to be a central focus in order also to keep Europe strong and vibrant. And I see Thomas is back now, so maybe he wants to continue his thought.
There's a debate, of course, about what is being done now, whether that is being done to keep the Americans in, or we're doing it because we have either a suspicion or a certainty that America will not be in Europe in a couple of years. I think we don't need to decide that question because the outcome is all the same. Things have to happen. Things have to happen quickly. And frankly, in many countries, things are happening, and they're happening quickly on the military side. I still am not content with the speed and the scale on the German side, where I think we're following along with the capability targets. But there is a set of issues that still need to be focused on: procurement reform, draft, modernization rather than F&E, lessons learned from the Ukraine war as a blueprint for modernization of the armed forces. So I think we're still we're spending the money, we're doing what is required, but are we preparing for the next conflict would be my question. And are we sufficiently looking at strategic enablers and everything the United States does exclusively? So I would say partially we're doing what needs to be done. We're not doing what Amanda said. I don't see the European response to Letta and Draghi. That, I think, is the most relevant hole in all of what we're doing. So I think we need to be, to sum this up, I think we need to be alerted by a document of honesty, as Amanda puts it, but it doesn't change the agenda. The agenda is the one that we know, and we know that the time to enact this agenda is maybe shorter than we think. Now to the question of Friedrich Merz. We all only have seen video clips, but I hope what he meant was this. If the United States doesn't see Europe as a partner, well, this is a nationalist document. Maybe it sees nation states, including Germany, as a document, as a partner. I hope that's what he meant. If he meant just Germany, that would be a contribution to splitting the alliance, just as as Trump seems to want. So again, I hope that's what he meant. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt.
Here are two more questions from the chat. One by Georg Baumgarten is asking about the very existence of the Transatlantic Alliance or partnership. Does it still exist? Can it be reversed, perhaps, by other politicians on either the Republican or Democratic side in the future? And possibly also to American citizens themselves, might there be a bit of a return wake-up call by the potential reaction of Europeans to this divorce, as Thomas called it? So that's one question. And the other, Oliver Korff is asking, about the element of flattery towards the president in this document, with Trump's name coming up multiple times and praising him as the king of peace, et cetera, et cetera. So might the audience, some of the audience of this document, be also very domestic in praising Trump rather than saying anything to the world, to the outside world? I think these are two questions for you primarily, Amanda, but I'm also happy to take up the others afterwards.
Yeah, on the second question, maybe, but I think Thomas's anecdote about the first Trump administration and the tweets was quite accurate. I mean, it is common practice in government to look at speeches and pronouncement that the president makes, and those get incorporated into talking points that you use in government. Now, normally that's a very deliberative process and a thoughtful process that goes into making those pronouncements. But I think a lot of diplomats now, without necessarily a normal order policy process and clarity about what the president's views are, really do rely on a lot of these tweets and social media presentations to understand what the president is thinking. And as I said earlier, this very much, I think, reflects the views of the president and those close to him. So flattery, possibly. I think things like the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine feed into some of that. But I think this also broadly reflects what Trump's views on that are and are consistent with how this administration has operated. On the second question of whether this document is going to be a wake-up call to the American people, my honest answer is no. I suspect most Americans are not aware of the document. They will not have read the document. Again, to be very honest, when I was not working in government, I did not necessarily read or follow debates around the national security strategies that were written by administrations that I was not part of. And again, this is very consistent with things that have been said by administration officials over the past year. So from that perspective and for an American perspective, there's not anything new. I think for people like me, others who are friends of Europe and the Transatlantic Alliance reacted with similar dismay to the way that Europeans did. But for average Americans, not. And frankly, average Americans have bigger problems at the moment. We have significant democratic regression. We have masked men without badges who are grabbing people out of cars, their places of work, and sending them to places like Sudan without due process. We have National Guard patrolling the streets. And so there is a tremendous amount of pressure that is being put on American democracy. And we have a lot of people who are pushing back more broadly against things that the administration is doing. You know, you're seeing a large number of protests. You're seeing Democrats in Congress who are actively trying to push back on things. You are starting to see some Republicans in Congress raise questions about things as well, including the strikes on the so-called narco boats off the coast of Venezuela. We're seeing some of these priorities that are coming through in the NDAA. And so I think you probably have a lot of Republicans in Congress that are also not going to be broadly comfortable with what this says about Europe. But frankly, we have Republicans in Congress who are not supportive of many of things that the administration is doing. The last thing I would say is I think there is broad frustration in the United States about the lack of European defense spending and readiness to take on its own capabilities. That is something that American presidents dating back to Eisenhower have said. It is something, Obama referred to Europe as free riders. Other presidents have made the same point. And so at a time when America is dealing with failing infrastructure, with sky-high medical bills, and a lot of domestic challenges, there is continuing to be less sympathy for some of the concerns in Europe about taking on more responsibility for its own security, because the US just financially is not going to be able to sustain that. The last point I would make on this is I think there continues to be a very understandable desire in Europe to believe that things are going to change, that the Democrats are going to come back in the midterms, that there's going to be a new president in 3 years. Maybe all of that is true. The Democrats did very well in elections in November. They may well do well in elections in the midterms. A Democratic-controlled Congress cannot change the direction of all of this alone. And even if we have a Democratic president who wins in 2028, there are still these fundamental shifts that are happening within American society. It is still very divided, and things are not going to go back to normal. So again, whether you want to call it a wake-up call, or I don't know how many of these it takes, it really is the moment for Europe to really double down on strengthening its own capabilities in areas across the board.
Did either of you, Rachel or Thomas, want to come in on this?
On the, if I may, on the transatlantic question on this.
Sure.
I mean, the transatlantic relationship and is the sort of Westernism in some ways has only had a liberal interpretation for the last several decades. Prior to that, it had a culturalist, and prior to that, it had an imperialist meaning. Before that, it had religious meaning. So there's different historical interpretation of what the West is all about. And certainly, the Trump administration wants to regress to a culturalist definition. That is why they don't trash the transatlantic relationship as a concept. And that is why they declare that they want to meddle in European affairs to get to where they want, a civilizationally based nationalist alliance. And they see, as the document explicitly states, optimism in the so-called patriotic parties in Europe. So they're waiting for what one of the people in the chat states, for Rassemblement National and other European parties, AfD, to take power, and they have strategies to help make that come about. And so that's where they're going. This is not the end, but a drastic redefinition of what the transatlantic relationship is or ought to be.
Thanks, Thomas. Let me try to collect a few more questions. One perhaps from Peter Linke, who's raised his hand in the audience. Over to you.
This is a general question. What does the new American national security strategy tell us about Washington's readiness to engage in any meaningful strategic disarmament talks? After all, we are facing a situation where the START treaty is running out soon, and we are facing also the problem of intermediate range ground-based missiles. So these are all things that could have, well, I expected it in one way or another to be included in this document, but there isn't any hint at that.
Right.
So
okay.
Maybe it's not the place. So maybe Amanda Sloat can help here. Maybe this is not the place to ask such questions. But given the situation, I think it would be necessary to include these questions in these kind of documents.
Got it. Thank you. So a question about disarmament. We also have a question by Timothy Marshall-Jones about the National Defense Authorization Act, showing some congressional pushback, for example, retaining the Sakura post for the US. And we have a question by Joe Mack, who's asking about basically Europe being a competitor when it comes to industrial and tech base. So competing with almost all the US industries eventually to reach out to worldwide markets. So there's that question, competitor question, NDAA question, disarmament question. I think that's all for now. Let me turn things over to Amanda first, and then we can pick up more questions and comments after that.
Yeah, I mean, on the arms control question, I mean, the national security strategy is not going to be the be all end all to provide answers to every single issue that's out there. And this is actually the document is about half the length of previous documents, and so I think this is seen as being a pretty narrow document setting out a broad set of principles. And there's lots of policy questions that it is left unanswered. So should it have included that in a broader discussion on Russia? Possibly. But as I said, I think it's a mistake to look at this document as a policy roadmap for everything that the administration is going to do. It sets out a broad conceptual prioritization. It gives a sense to Congress and the public about how it is seeing the world and about how it is seeing priorities, but is not addressing every single specific priority. And I think that's the case there on Russia. As Thomas said, they have talked about wanting broad strategic stability with Russia. So the suggestion would be that there would be an interest in maintaining these frameworks and discussions with them. But as you said, it's not clear from the document on that. On the NDAA, I mean, I think this is going to be an opportunity for the Congress to set out its views, which I think are much more favorable of Europe than what the administrations certainly are. My understanding is that there's provisions in the NDAA, for example, that put funding in for continuing to support the Baltic Reassurance Initiative. The administration had not asked for funding for that initiative, but Congress put that in, which continues to show their support for that. There's also been messaging from Congress about not wanting to have the administration draw down troops within Congress. I was not tracking the debate over the SACEUR provision that you had mentioned. The U.S., I think, would essentially have to be prepared to leave NATO before they would give up the SACEUR position. I think it obviously gives the U.S. a tremendous amount of leadership capability within the alliance. And it also just is a practical necessity because the head of SACEUR is also the head of EUCOM. And so if you needed forces in a contingency, it's essentially the EUCOM commander wearing that hat, handing the forces over to the SACEUR commander, which is himself, in a different hat. And so I think there's also practical reasons why it's made sense for the SACEUR to be American.
Thanks, Amanda. Rachel, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll come in on to sort of add a little more gradation to this point about pushback from Congress. I mean, part of the reason that the practical reaction of European leaders hasn't been more dramatic, sort of more dramatically anti-US, is that although this administration has been pretty consistent and clear and is positioned in a not in a rather adversarial relationship to Europe, most of the defense establishment, most of Congress, most of the people who are involved in all of the policy happening all of the time, only a small fraction of which Trump is actually paying attention to, is running sort of like normal. And so there are different messages being sent at the same time. That said, there is one very consistent message that predates Trump and will outlast Trump, which is Europeans need to do more. All Americans want Europe to do more. Obama wanted it. Trump wanted it. Congress wants it. Everybody wants it. Okay? So that's very consistent. But whether the US wants to be a strong partner, still hold the SACEUR, be a leader in NATO, the majority of the messaging from the sort of defense industrial complex and Congress is still rather consistent. And so, these things come and the language is shocking. And if that sort of nudges Europeans in the right direction or gives sort of political leeway for increased defense spending because the reliance on the US looks problematic, that's potentially good. But there are different messaging and different realities happening at the same time. And that makes the picture just complex.
Thanks, Rachel. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I know that both Amanda and Rachel have to run off to subsequent meetings, so we have to keep things short, and I apologize for not being able to pick up all questions in the chat. There's one more by all the way down by Helmut Hoffmann, who's asking about what exactly it is that the Americans are asking the Europeans to spend on militarily, because on the one hand, the national security strategy says that Europe holds a significant hard power advantage over Russia, save for nuclear weapons, but at the same time is asking to significantly increase military spending. So what is being asked here specifically? So that's one question, but please also feel free to pick up points that you saw in the chat or heard in your colleagues on the panel that you want to pick up. And I want to use this as a sort of closing remarks round. So a maximum of 90 seconds each to close things and make any comments that you think are still left out there. Let's go in reverse order of the panel this time round and start with you, Rachel.
Sure. So Amanda mentioned it. There are capability targets that have been worked out in terms of what Europe would need to be able to do to capably defend itself, and there are significant shortcomings. Also because of interoperability and doubling of capacities, and then the lack of certain strategic enabling capacities. So it is very much the case that there are certain things that Europe needs to build quickly. Especially, we haven't really even talked about the ongoing war in Ukraine, but especially because there is an ongoing war, and the support that Ukraine needs weekly is actually more than it's getting, and Europe is going to have to continue to carry that burden. All of these realities remain the same, and the NSS is just black and white some of the issues that Europe confronts with the transatlantic relationship. But I would just remind everyone, this is just a document. It's not even delivering what it promises in terms of actual strategic vision or clarity. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was also partially intended to provoke a reaction.
Thanks.
While we don't know what the relevance and the durability and the depth of impact of this document is, it is abundantly clear from this document, as from many other pronouncements that we know, that what needs to be done, and we should focus. We should take this as a sort of another data point on the whole list of things that has brought certainly Germans to the conclusions that they have to reinvest in military, that they have to reinvest in economic power, have to reinvest in power, full stop. Second point is the culture war component. I think it's very clear that this is an aggressive document directed at liberalism. As I said, it's an anti-Enlightenment document, and the way to address the right-wing nationalist challenge is not one that one can simply only address through this document or even through opposition to this document. This is a domestic challenge that is going to be with us for some time, and I think we have to cross fingers that the United States is able to manage the populist uprising, because if the United States isn't, we will continue to have this divisive language and attempt coming from the United States into Europe, which we can't use and need to defend against.
Amanda.
I completely agree with everything that Rachel and Thomas just said. Two broad points. One on the question of capabilities, as Rachel said, NATO planners have made that very explicit. If you look back at the war in Libya in 2011, that Europeans had advocated, that Obama joined from a position of leading from behind, the U.S. had to provide critical enablers that Europe lacked. Fast forward to 2025, Europe still lacks those critical political enablers, which means that it can't field a reassurance force in Ukraine without the help of the United States. And that includes things like strategic airlift, advanced intelligence, and some of the more advanced long-range missile capabilities, as well as sustained air defense. So those are all things that Europe needs to invest in because they are gaps. And you also still have a wide variation in standards across Europe, even on things like 155 ammunitions, types of tanks, which we found when we were trying to surge military support to the Ukrainians. Second broad point, the Transatlantic Alliance is always going to exist in some form. I mean, our countries are bound together by shared histories, by economics, and in even broader security interests. The question, and this is what Thomas was alluding to, is whether it's going to be an alliance that is united by shared democratic and liberal values, or whether it's one that's going to be bound together by illiberal values. And I am very worried both about the Trump administration's interference in European domestic politics, and even separate from that, a lot of the very worrying trends we're seeing, including in countries like Germany, France, and the UK, where you have rising support for the far right and populist parties, that my worst case scenario is that we end up with a transatlantic alliance led by illiberal leaders. So let me end it on sorry, a rather pessimistic note.
Thanks for ending on a happy note, Amanda. Thanks to all of our panelists, and thanks to you in the audience for tuning in. This was our last morning briefing in 2025. See you again next year at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks again, and have a good day. Bye-bye.